At 9:17 on the morning of March 4, 1944, a formation of 16 P-51 Mustangs crossed the German border, flying at 28,000 feet. The engines hummed steadily in the thin air, trails of vapor streaming behind each aircraft. Below, the German countryside stretched to the horizon, deceptively peaceful from 5 miles up. The flight leader was Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, a hard-driving commander who had been flying combat since 1941. His pilots were about to attempt something that had never been done. They were escorting Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses all the way to Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, and back, a round trip of nearly 1,100 miles. 3 days earlier, Blakesley's pilots had received their new aircraft. Some had less than an hour of flight time in the Mustang before this mission. When they asked about training, Blakesley gave them an answer that would become legendary. "You can learn to fly 51s on the way to the target." There was no time for anything else. The bomber crews were dying, and every day of delay cost more lives. What happened in the skies over Berlin that morning would change how the air war was fought for the rest of World War II. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe had owned the skies over Germany. American bomber crews called the area beyond fighter escort range the killing zone. That name was earned in blood. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a massive raid against ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft plants at Regensburg. The double strike was designed to cripple German war production. Instead, it nearly crippled the 8th Air Force. Of 376 heavy bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down. Hundreds more limped home with battle damage. 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The losses were unsustainable. At that rate of attrition, the 8th Air Force would destroy itself before it destroyed Germany. But the strategic bombing campaign was considered essential to victory. Without it, the Wehrmacht could manufacture tanks, aircraft, and weapons indefinitely. The invasion of Europe would face an enemy at full strength. The problem was brutally simple. American fighters could not fly far enough to protect the bombers. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a formidable aircraft, heavily armed and nearly indestructible. Pilots called it the Jug because it resembled a milk jug. It could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying, but its fuel consumption was prodigious and its range was limited. The Thunderbolt could escort bombers partway into Germany, perhaps 300 miles, then it had to turn back or fall out of the sky. Luftwaffe pilots learned this limitation precisely. They tracked American formations on radar, monitoring the escort fighters carefully. When the Thunderbolts reached their fuel limit and turned for home, German controllers vectored interceptors toward the now defenseless bombers. The timing was calculated to the minute. Inside those B-17s, radio operators listened to the fighter pilots calling out their farewells. Little friends heading home. Good luck. Then silence, except for the drone of engines and the knowledge that the killing zone awaited. When the German fighters arrived, they came in waves. First, the twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Me-410s, heavy fighters carrying rockets, 30mm cannons, and even air-to-air grenades. These Zerstörer, or destroyer, aircraft would stand off beyond machine gun range and lob their ordnance into the bomber formations. A single rocket hit could destroy a B-17. After the heavy fighters softened the formation, the single-engine Bf-109s and Fokker-Wulf 190s attacked. Fast and maneuverable, they made slashing passes through the bomber boxes, their cannon shells tearing through aluminum skin. They came from ahead, from the sides, from below. They coordinated their attacks to overwhelm the defensive fire, and they kept coming. Second, Schweinfurt, on October 14, 1943, was worse than the first. 291 B-17s took off that morning. 60 never came back. 138 more limped home with battle damage, many so severe the aircraft would never fly again. The 8th Air Force had sacrificed 1/4 of its attacking force to hit a single target. The casualties were devastating. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men. 60 aircraft meant 600 airmen killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. Many of those captured had survived being shot down only to parachute into hostile territory, where civilians sometimes killed them before German authorities could intervene. After Second Schweinfurt, deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended indefinitely. The 8th Air Force could not sustain losses at this rate. Crews who had signed up for 25 mission tours calculated their odds and found them bleak. At 10% losses per mission, the mathematics said that completing a tour was statistically impossible. General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, understood the implications. Without long-range escorts that could protect bombers all the way to their targets and back, the strategic bombing campaign would fail. Germany would continue producing the weapons that kept the Wehrmacht fighting. The invasion of Europe would become far more costly. The war might drag on for years longer. What nobody expected was that the solution would come from a British test pilot flying an American aircraft with a British engine. Sometimes history turns on a single insight. In April 1942, Ronald Harker of Rolls-Royce flew an American-built Mustang at the Royal Air Force Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, England. The aircraft had been designed by North American Aviation in response to a British request, created in just 102 days from contract to first flight. The British had originally wanted North American to build P-40 Warhawks under license. Instead, the company proposed building something better. The result was the NA-73, which became the Mustang. Harker was impressed. The aircraft was fast at low altitude, faster than a Spitfire below 15,000 feet. Its handling was excellent. Its range was remarkable, thanks to an efficient laminar flow wing design and large internal fuel capacity. But above 15,000 feet, performance deteriorated badly. The Allison V1710 engine simply could not breathe in thin air. Its single-stage supercharger was inadequate for high-altitude operations. This was a critical limitation. High altitude was where bomber formations flew. High altitude was where fighter combat occurred. An aircraft that could not perform above 15,000 feet was of limited use for escort missions. Harker had an idea that would change aviation history. The Mustang airframe was aerodynamically superior to anything else in Allied inventory. What it needed was a better engine. He recommended fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same engine that powered the latest Spitfires. The Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine could maintain power at extreme altitudes. Combined with the Mustang's efficient airframe and internal fuel capacity, it would create something entirely new, a fighter that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything the Germans possessed. The proposal met resistance. British Merlin production was already allocated to Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes. There were none to spare for American aircraft. But the idea had taken hold. In August 1942, Rolls-Royce began converting 5 Mustang airframes to accept Merlin engines. They were designated Mustang X. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew on October 13, 1942, with Captain R.T. Shepard at the controls. The results were spectacular beyond anyone's expectations. Top speed jumped to 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet. Rate of climb increased dramatically. The aircraft reached 20,000 feet in under 6 minutes, compared to over 9 minutes for the Allison-powered version. Most importantly, the Merlin Mustang maintained its performance at high altitude. At 25,000 feet, it could still fight effectively. At 30,000 feet, it could still pursue. At 35,000 feet, above the ceiling of most German fighters, it remained fully operational. The altitude limitations that had crippled the original design were gone. The transformation was remarkable. The same airframe that had struggled above 15,000 feet now excelled at any altitude the war demanded. Colonel Bud Anderson later described the experience of flying a Merlin Mustang in combat. The Merlin had great gobs of power, he wrote, and was equally at home high or low, thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger. The aircraft responded instantly to throttle inputs at any altitude. There was no sag, no hesitation, no loss of power when you needed it most. Word reached America immediately. The Packard Motor Company was already producing Merlins under license for other aircraft, designated V1650. North American Aviation began work on integrating the Packard Merlin into the Mustang airframe. making modifications necessary to accommodate the different engine dimensions and cooling requirements. The first American-built XP-51B flew on November 30th, 1942, just weeks after the British conversion. Flight tests confirmed everything the British had discovered. The aircraft was transformed. Even before testing was complete, the Army Air Forces ordered 2,200 of the new machines. Production began at North American's Inglewood, California plant in June 1943. A second production line opened at a new facility in Dallas, Texas. By late 1943, Mustangs were flowing off the assembly lines in increasing numbers. When Blakesley and his pilots crossed into Germany on March 4, 1944, they were flying machines that should not have existed. Aircraft born from a British insight, American manufacturing, and the desperate necessity of war. The first American fighter group to receive the P-51B was the 354th Fighter Group. They arrived in England in November 1943. Their pilots trained on P-39 Airacobras, an aircraft completely unsuitable for combat in Europe. When they discovered they would fly Mustangs instead, most had never seen one. The 354th flew their first mission on December 1st, 1943, a fighter sweep over France led by Colonel Donald Blakesley, who had been seconded to the group because of his combat experience. 2 weeks later, on December 13th, they escorted bombers to Kiel, 480 miles inside Germany. It was the deepest penetration by single-engine American fighters in the war to date. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had. For the first time, German pilots faced American escorts that could fight them at any altitude, match their performance, and stay with the bombers all the way to the target. The rules of engagement had changed. The 354th produced the first Mustang Ace and earned a distinguished unit citation for developing long-range escort tactics. But it was one mission in January that revealed the Mustang's true potential. Major James Howard was not like other fighter pilots in the European theatre. He had already fought a war before arriving in England. Born in Canton, China, to American medical missionary parents, Howard grew up in the Far East. He learned to fly after college, joined the United States Navy, and earned his wings at Pensacola in 1939. But peacetime military flying was not enough. When he heard about the American volunteer group forming to fight the Japanese in China, he resigned his Navy commission and joined. The Flying Tigers, as they became known, flew P-40 Warhawks against Japanese bombers and fighters over Burma and China. Howard flew 56 combat missions and destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft, becoming an ace in the Pacific before most Americans had even heard of the war. When he returned to the United States after Pearl Harbor, Howard could have stayed home. He had done his part. Instead, he joined the Army Air Forces and requested combat assignment. He was given command of the 356th Fighter Squadron of the 354th Fighter Group. He would fight his second war in a Mustang named Ding Hao, Chinese slang for very good. On January 11, 1944, Howard led his squadron escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses to Oschersleben, about 100 miles southwest of Berlin. The target was German aircraft factories, the heart of Luftwaffe production. 525 B-17s and 138 B-24 Liberators made up the bomber stream. Every German fighter in the region would be defending those factories. When Luftwaffe interceptors attacked, Howard's formation engaged immediately. In the chaos of the initial contact, Howard became separated from his wingman and then from the rest of his squadron. He climbed back toward the bomber formation, searching for friendly fighters. There were none to be seen. What he saw instead made his pulse hammer. More than 30 German fighters were swarming around the B-17s of the 401st Bomb Group. Twin-engine Bf-110s and single-engine W-190s were making coordinated attacks, pouring cannon fire into the bomber formation. Aircraft were going down in flames. Parachutes blossomed against the winter sky. Howard had a choice. He could search for his squadron and reform. That was the safe option. The doctrine, the sensible decision. The B-17s would have to fend for themselves. He pushed his throttle forward and dove into the German formation alone. For the next 30 minutes, James Howard fought a battle that would become legend. He was everywhere at once, diving on German fighters before they could set up attack runs, breaking up formations, forcing pilots to abandon their approaches. His 50-caliber machine guns hammered constantly. He shot down a Bf-110 on his first pass, the heavy fighter exploding in flames. Then he caught another trying to position for a rocket attack. A burst from close range sent it spinning toward the earth. A Focke-Wulf 190 crossed his sights and he fired, watching pieces fly off before the aircraft fell away. German pilots saw a single Mustang that seemed to be everywhere at once. They would line up on a B-17, only to have tracer fire from behind force them to break off. They would form up for a coordinated attack, only to have Howard slash through their formation. It was impossible. It was one aircraft against more than 30. Toward the end of the engagement, 3 of Howard's 450 caliber machine guns jammed from overheating. His fuel was running critically low. Any rational calculation said he should break off, find a friendly airfield, and land. Instead, he continued attacking. With 1 gun firing intermittently and 3 guns silent, Howard made dry passes at German fighters. He dove at them head-on, forcing them to evade. He chased them off the bombers through sheer aggression, attacking without ammunition simply to protect the men flying those B-17s. When he finally had to break off, his aircraft bore a single bullet hole. The bombers he protected made it home. The crews of the 401st Bomb Group reported being escorted by a single P-51 that stayed with them for over 30 minutes, attacking dozens of German fighters single-handedly. Major Alison Brooks, the group leader, called Howard a one-man air force. "Who was that Mustang pilot?" demanded Colonel Harold Bowman, the unit commander, who took on the German Air Force single-handedly and saved our 401st Bomb Group from disaster. The answer spread quickly. Correspondent Andy Rooney, then a reporter for Stars and Stripes, described Howard's action as the greatest fighter pilot story of World War II. In June 1944, Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz presented Howard with the Medal of Honor. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater of operations to receive that decoration during the war. But Howard's action was more than individual heroism. It demonstrated what the P-51 could do in the hands of a skilled pilot. A single Mustang had held off more than 30 Luftwaffe interceptors and protected an entire bomber formation for half an hour. The implications were clear. With enough Mustangs, properly employed, the 8th Air Force could take the fight to Germany and win. The transformation of the air war began in earnest 3 weeks later. From February 20th through February 25th, 1944, the United States Army Air Forces launched Operation Argument, a massive assault on German aircraft production that became known as Big Week. The plan was deliberately provocative. By attacking factories that produced Luftwaffe fighters, American commanders intended to force the Germans into the sky. If the Germans defended their aircraft plants, they would have to fight against American escorts. If they refused to fight, they would lose the capacity to defend anything else. Either way, the Luftwaffe would be destroyed. Over 6 days, 8th Air Force bombers from England flew more than 3,000 sorties. The 15th Air Force in Italy contributed 500 more. Targets included Brunswick, Leipzig, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Augsburg, and Stuttgart. Every major aircraft manufacturing center in Germany was hit, but the bombers were not alone. For the first time, American fighters flew with them all the way to the targets and all the way back. P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts with new external fuel tanks, and P-38 Lightnings provided continuous escort. When Luftwaffe interceptors rose to defend, they found themselves fighting an air war completely different from what they had experienced before. The twin-engine Zerstorer units suffered worst. The Bf-110s and Me-410s that had massacred unescorted bomber formations were slaughtered when facing Mustang opposition. These heavy fighters carried devastating armament, rocket launchers, and 30mm cannons that could destroy a B-17 with a single hit. But they were slow. They were unmaneuverable. They needed time to set up their attack runs. The Mustangs gave them no time. On the first day of Big Week alone, American fighters destroyed 74 German aircraft. Many were the heavy fighters that had been the backbone of bomber interception. Entire Gruppen were decimated. Pilots who had survived dozens of missions against unescorted bombers died in their first encounter with Mustang escorts. The single-engine Bf-109s and Fw-190s fared better, but not by much. German pilots had trained to attack bombers, not to fight opposing escorts. Their tactics were designed to close quickly, deliver a killing blow to the heavy bombers, and escape before retaliation could arrive. Now the retaliation was there before them, during their attack, and after. There was nowhere to hide. More worrying for the Luftwaffe, the German fighter force, was the quality of pilots they were losing. Big Week killed nearly 100 German fighter pilots in just over a week. That represented 17% of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilot strength. Many of those killed were experienced veterans, flight leaders, and squadron commanders who had accumulated dozens of victories. These men could not be replaced. The statistics told a brutal story. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe wrote off 30.3% of its single-engine fighters and lost 16.9% of its pilots. The attrition was catastrophic. Germany was producing aircraft faster than ever, but the pilots to fly them were dying faster than new ones could be trained. The impact on specific units was devastating. Some Jagdgruppen lost half their pilots in a single month. Experienced flight leaders who had accumulated 50 or 100 victories were shot down by American pilots with barely a dozen missions. The tactical knowledge these veterans possessed, learned through years of combat, vanished with them. The pilots who replaced them had neither the skills nor the experience to survive. Even worse for the Luftwaffe, the losses included many Gruppenkommandure and Staffelkapitane, the unit leaders responsible for training new pilots and leading them in combat. Without experienced leaders, young pilots made mistakes that cost their lives. Without mentors, they never learned the tricks that kept veterans alive. The institutional knowledge of the Jagdwaffe was bleeding away. When Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring saw American Mustangs over Berlin, he reportedly said that he knew the jig was up. Whether those exact words were spoken, the sentiment was accurate. The Luftwaffe was being bled to death over its own territory. Every pilot lost defending Germany was a pilot who could not be replaced with anyone of equal skill. The 4th Fighter Group, known as the Debden Eagles, epitomized the transformation. Formed from 3 Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons of American volunteers who had fought before Pearl Harbor, the group had been flying combat since 1941. They knew their enemy. On February 28, 1944, the 4th received P-51 Mustangs to replace their P-47 Thunderbolts. Pilots who had loved their rugged jugs were skeptical of the lighter, more delicate-looking Mustangs. Colonel Blakesley gave them no time for doubt. Days later, they were flying combat over Germany. Among the 4th's pilots were Captain Don Gentile and Lieutenant John Godfrey, who became the deadliest wingman team in the 8th Air Force. Gentile was a first-generation American from Piqua, Ohio, the son of Italian immigrants. He had been obsessed with flying since childhood, saving his date money to buy an airplane. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force before the United States entered the war and flew Spitfires with 133 Eagle Squadron. By the time he transferred to the American 4th Fighter Group, he already had 2 aerial victories. Johnny Godfrey was his wingman. Together they developed tactics that turned conventional fighter doctrine inside out. Whoever spotted the enemy first and had the best position would lead the attack. The other would cover. They communicated constantly, watching each other's blind spots, coordinating their strikes. Luftwaffe pilots who thought they were bouncing a single aircraft would suddenly find themselves under attack from 2 directions. Göring allegedly offered the equivalent of 2 squadrons for the capture of Gentile and Godfrey. He called them the Debden Gangsters. Between them, they destroyed 37 German aircraft. On March 8, 1944, over Berlin, Gentile and Godfrey encountered approximately 50 German fighters attacking a bomber formation. With only their 2 aircraft as support, Gentile attacked immediately. In the dogfight that followed, he shot down 3 enemy aircraft and damaged a 4th. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for that action. Over the following weeks, Gentile accumulated kills at a remarkable rate. His Mustang, named Shangri-La after the fictional paradise in the novel Lost Horizon, became one of the most recognized aircraft in the 8th Air Force. By April 5, 1944, he had destroyed 27 enemy aircraft, surpassing the World War I record of 26, held by Eddie Rickenbacker. On April 13th, Gentile's combat career ended not in battle but in accident. Returning from a mission, he buzzed the Debden airfield for assembled press reporters and movie cameras. He came in too low, too fast, struck the ground, and destroyed his aircraft. Colonel Blakesley, who had established a rule that anyone who crashed his plane showing off would be grounded, was furious. Gentile was sent home to sell war bonds. His final tally was 21.83 aerial victories plus 6 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The 4th Fighter Group would go on to destroy 1,016 German aircraft during the war, more than any other American fighter unit. They produced numerous aces, established tactical innovations that influenced fighter combat for decades, and demonstrated that American pilots could match anyone in the sky. The 357th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Yoxford Boys after the English village near their base, produced some of the most successful Mustang pilots of the war. Among them was Captain Clarence Bud Anderson, who would become a triple ace with 16¼ aerial victories. Anderson arrived in England in late 1943 with the 357th. Like many fighter groups, they had trained on aircraft unsuitable for the European air war. When they discovered they would fly Mustangs, Anderson recalled that some pilots had less than 30 hours in the aircraft before their first combat mission. They learned fast, or they died. What made Anderson exceptional was that he flew 116 combat missions without ever being hit by enemy fire. His aircraft, both named Old Crow after his favorite bourbon whiskey, carried him through 2 combat tours without a scratch. No forced landings, no damage from enemy action, no mechanical failures that ended a mission. In the deadliest skies of the war, Anderson's survival seemed supernatural. His remarkable record became legendary among his squadron mates, but it was not luck. Anderson had exceptional eyesight. He could spot enemy aircraft before others in his formation, tiny dots in the distance that gave precious seconds of warning. He maintained constant awareness, checking behind, checking above, checking the sun where German pilots liked to lurk. He flew aggressively when attacking but never carelessly. Every decision was calculated to maximize damage to the enemy while minimizing risk to himself. Anderson and another 357th pilot became close friends during the war. His name was Chuck Yeager. On October 12, 1944, Yeager shot down 5 German aircraft on a single mission, becoming an ace in a day. He would later become the first person to break the sound barrier, but during the war, he was simply one of the most aggressive fighter pilots in the 8th Air Force. The 357th was credited with 595½ aerial victories, second among 8th Air Force fighter groups. Only the 56th Fighter Group, which had been in combat significantly longer, had more. The Mustang groups were dominating the air war at a level that stunned both sides. German pilots knew something had changed fundamentally. Tactics that had worked for years were suddenly failing. Hauptmann Gunther Rohl was Germany's 3rd highest scoring ace, with 275 aerial victories, most against Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front. When he transferred to the defense of the Reich in 1944, he encountered Mustangs for the first time. After the war, Rohl flew captured P-51s at a German testing facility and was profoundly impressed. The cockpit was comfortable, he noted, unlike the cramped Bf-109. You could not fly a 109 for 7 hours. The cockpit was too tight, too narrow. The P-51 was a great room in comparison. The Merlin engine impressed him even more. The electric starting switches, which German aircraft lacked, made cold weather operations far easier. The lack of oil leaks seemed miraculous to pilots accustomed to German machinery that dripped constantly. The smooth running of the engine at cruising speed reduced pilot fatigue significantly. But what truly impressed Rohl was the Mustang's endurance. German fighters could stay airborne for 1 hour and 20 minutes, perhaps 90 minutes, with careful fuel management. The Mustang could fly for 7 hours. In combat, this difference was decisive. When we were short on fuel, Rohl explained, we had to break off and land at the nearest airfield. The Americans still had fuel for 3 hours more. They could pursue us to our bases, strafe us on the ground, circle and wait for us to take off again. We had no sanctuary. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging at a rate that could not be sustained. Monthly pilot losses reached 25%. In some units, the attrition was higher. Aircraft production peaked in August 1944, finally matching Allied output, but there were not enough trained pilots to fly the new machines. Training schools had been disrupted by fuel shortages and by Allied fighter sweeps that attacked student pilots during training flights. Young men who would have received 200 hours of flight time before the war were being sent to combat squadrons with less than 100 hours total. Some had never fired their guns in the air. Some had never practiced formation flying. The result was a vicious circle of destruction. Inexperienced pilots died quickly, often on their first or second mission. This increased pressure on training programs to produce replacements faster. Faster training meant less prepared pilots. Less prepared pilots died even faster. The quality of the Luftwaffe fighter force declined steadily as veterans were killed and replaced with novices who became victims themselves. Allied fighter sweeps made training even more dangerous. American Mustangs ranged deep into German airspace, attacking training fields and shooting down student pilots on practice flights. There were no safe areas left in which to learn. Young men died before they had a chance to develop the skills that might have kept them alive. The contrast with American training was stark. By early 1944, American fighter pilots entering combat averaged over 450 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice and tactical training. They arrived at their squadrons, knowing their aircraft, knowing their weapons, and knowing the basic tactics that would keep them alive. German pilots of equal experience were largely dead. The disparity grew worse with each passing month. A German pilot who survived his first 5 missions had a reasonable chance of becoming effective. Most did not survive 5 missions. The few who did found themselves carrying an ever heavier burden as the veterans around them were killed. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, understood this dynamic intimately. In January 1944, he had changed fighter doctrine fundamentally. Previously, American escort fighters were required to stay close to their bomber charges, weaving above them in protective formation. Doolittle removed that restriction. When he visited his subordinate commander at the 8th Fighter Command, Doolittle noticed a sign on the wall. It read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle told his general to take the sign down. A new one replaced it. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." This was considerably more than fighter pilot bravado. It was a strategic transformation. American fighters were unleashed from close escort. Instead of waiting for attacks, Mustang pilots swept ahead of bomber formations, hunting Luftwaffe aircraft as they formed up. They dove on airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground before they could take off. They chased retreating fighters back to their bases. They attacked German aircraft during takeoff and landing, the most vulnerable phases of flight. The Luftwaffe was given no sanctuary. Ground crews who had worked in relative safety suddenly faced strafing runs that destroyed aircraft, fuel supplies, and maintenance facilities. The German fighter force was being dismantled not just in the air but on the ground. By June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe could barely respond. Over the invasion beaches, the greatest military operation in history, German aircraft were almost completely absent. The Allies fielded over 5,400 fighters and fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe managed 319 sorties on D-Day. The ratio was 17-1 in Allied favour. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had warned that the invasion would be decided in its first 24 hours. He was right, but not in the way he anticipated. The absence of German air power over the beaches allowed Allied forces to consolidate their positions without interference from above. Allied soldiers wading ashore on the beaches of Normandy looked up and saw only friendly aircraft. The feared Luftwaffe, which had strafed refugees during the fall of France, which had bombed London during the Blitz, which had seemed invincible just 2 years earlier, was nowhere to be seen. When German aircraft did appear, they were quickly shot down or driven off. The contrast with earlier invasions was stark. During the landings at Salerno in 1943, Luftwaffe attacks with guided bombs had nearly pushed the invasion back into the sea. At Anzio, German air attacks had caused significant casualties. Allied commanders had planned for heavy losses from air attack during the Normandy landing. Those losses never materialized because the air war had already been won. In June 1944 alone, the month of the Normandy invasion, Allied sorties were tenfold those of the Germans. The Luftwaffe lost 931 aircraft in combat over France. By the end of the month, German fighter strength in France had fallen to 425 machines. These surviving aircraft were constantly under attack, their airfields bombed, their pilots exhausted. The Luftwaffe never recovered its strength in the West. The Mustang had done what no other weapon could do. It had extended American power to the heart of Germany and destroyed the Luftwaffe in the process. Not all recognition came during the war. The men who designed and built the Mustang received relatively little public attention while the conflict raged. North American aviation created the aircraft in record time to meet a British request. The company's chief designer, Edgar Schmude, led a team that produced one of the most aerodynamically efficient fighters ever built. Schmude, a German-born engineer who had immigrated to the United States, incorporated innovations that were ahead of their time. The laminar flow wing was the most significant innovation. Conventional wings created turbulent airflow that caused drag. The Mustang's wing was designed to maintain smooth, laminar airflow over a greater portion of its surface, significantly reducing drag. This translated directly into higher speed and longer range for the same fuel consumption. The radiator placement was another stroke of genius. Most fighters mounted their engine cooling radiators in positions that created drag. North American's engineers placed the radiator beneath the fuselage in a carefully designed scoop that actually generated thrust. As air passed through the radiator and was heated, it expanded and accelerated, pushing the aircraft forward. Cooling drag was transformed into a performance advantage. The Senate War Investigating Committee, headed by Senator Harry Truman, called the P-51 the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. This was not wartime propaganda. It was technical assessment by people who understood aircraft design. The Mustang was simply better engineered than its contemporaries. The Packard Motor Company produced the American-built Merlin engines, designated V1650. These engines delivered reliable power at altitudes where other engines failed. The two-stage supercharger maintained performance from sea level to 40,000 feet. The combination of American manufacturing capacity and British engine technology created a weapon that neither country could have produced alone. Approximately 15,300 Mustangs were built during the war. Of these, over 13,000 were Merlin-powered variants. The P-51D, with its bubble canopy for improved visibility and 650 caliber machine guns, became the definitive version. By the end of 1944, it equipped 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. American Mustang pilots destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the European theater, more than any other American fighter type. But the Mustang's impact extended far beyond kill counts. By establishing air superiority over Germany, it enabled the strategic bombing campaign that crippled German industry. By protecting invasion forces, it made D-Day possible. By destroying the Luftwaffe as a fighting force, it shortened the war. The pilots who flew the Mustang understood what they had accomplished. After the war, they scattered to different lives, different careers, different fates. Colonel Donald Blakesley, who had led the first escort mission to Berlin, returned to the United States and continued his military career. He had flown more combat missions than almost any other American fighter pilot and had built the 4th Fighter Group into the most successful unit in the 8th Air Force. Don Gentile, the one-man Air Force who had destroyed more German aircraft than Rickenbacker, was killed in a training accident on January 28, 1951. He was flying a T-33 jet trainer near Andrews Air Force Base when his aircraft crashed in Forestville, Maryland. He was 30 years old. He left behind his wife Isabella and 3 sons. Bud Anderson survived the war and continued flying for 3 more decades. He became a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base, participated in experimental programs, including the bizarre FICON project that attached fighters to bombers for range extension, and flew combat missions in Vietnam as commander of the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing. He flew F-105 Thunder Chiefs against North Vietnamese targets, earning additional decorations to add to those from World War II. Anderson retired as a colonel in 1972 after logging over 7,000 hours in more than 130 aircraft types. He wrote an autobiography titled To Fly and Fight and became a sought-after speaker at aviation events. When he died in May 2024, at the age of 102, he was the last surviving triple ace of World War II. James Howard, the man who fought alone over Oschersleben, left active military service after the war, but remained in the Air Force Reserve. He pursued a business career, wrote an autobiography, and became Director of Aeronautics for the city of St. Louis. He passed away in March 1995 at the age of 81 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier on October 14, 1947, becoming the most famous test pilot in American history. He credited his combat experience in the Mustang with preparing him for the risks of experimental aviation. The skills he learned fighting Luftwaffe pilots over Germany served him well when pushing the boundaries of human flight. Günther Roll, the German ace who flew captured Mustangs after the war, joined the new West German Luftwaffe in the 1950s. He eventually rose to command it as Chief of Staff, responsible for defending his country against the same Soviets he had fought during the war. Former enemies became NATO allies. Roll and American pilots who had been his adversaries became friends. When Bud Anderson published the updated edition of his autobiography, Günther Roll wrote the foreword. Two men who had tried to kill each other in the skies over Germany found common ground in their shared love of flying and their mutual respect for each other's skill. The legacy of the Mustang extends beyond World War II. The aircraft served in Korea, flying ground attack missions until replaced by jets. It served in numerous air forces around the world into the 1960s. Israel flew Mustangs in the 1948 War of Independence and again during the 1956 Sinai Campaign. South American air forces operated them for decades after the war ended. Today, restored Mustangs fly at air shows around the world. The distinctive growl of the Merlin engine is instantly recognizable to aviation enthusiasts. These aircraft are living reminders of an era when piston engines and propellers dominated the sky, when pilots fought alone in the cold at 30,000 feet, when victory and death were separated by fractions of a second. But the Mustang's true legacy is not the aircraft itself. It is what the aircraft represented. It was British insight recognizing what American engineers had built. It was American manufacturing producing thousands of aircraft to the highest standards. It was tactical innovation transforming how fighter escorts operated. It was individual courage from pilots who flew into the heart of enemy territory knowing they might not return. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring understood what had happened, even if he could not prevent it. After the war, he made a statement that summarized the strategic situation with brutal clarity. The reason for the failure of the Luftwaffe against the Allied air forces was the success of the American air forces in putting out a long-range escort fighter airplane, which enabled the bombers to penetrate deep into Reich territory, still have a constant and strong fighter cover. Without this escort, the air offensive would never have succeeded. The P-51 Mustang did not win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it solved a problem that had seemed insoluble. It extended American power across distances that should have been impossible. It destroyed an air force that had conquered Europe. The pilots who flew it earned a place in history. The engineers who designed it created a masterpiece. The workers who built it armed a nation. That is what the P-51 Mustang accomplished. Not through revolutionary technology or secret weapons, but through the patient work of turning a good aircraft into a great one, through the courage of pilots who flew missions they knew might be their last, through the strategic vision of commanders who understood that air superiority was the key to victory. The Mustang gave American pilots the ability to fly anywhere, fight anyone, and win. In the end, that was enough. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.